So my name is Jonathan Diamond. I'm one of 4 principals at a family company. My brother and I, Gabriel Diamond, we're 3rd generation, and we work with our father, Harvey, who's here, and Bernice, who wasn't able to make it to Venice today. And the business invests in long-term assets, both multifamily apartment buildings and commercial retail centers in southern Ontario.
So Jonathan, can you please tell us more about this very innovative and sustainable housing project?
So this project was really started with sort of a problem, and the problem was, how do you design a mid-market apartment building for the City of Toronto? And if you're not familiar with the City of Toronto, we're in a housing crisis right now. So the population is growing, we're building a lot, but we're not building enough, and prices are getting higher and higher each day. So if you see a paper from Toronto, it's always about the housing crisis. There's a lack of supply, and that's driving the prices up. And so the site that we had was already existing. And so we were capped by the market in that area. And so we had a very specific problem, which is how do you build an apartment for the long term that was economically feasible? And so we had this really sort of long-term lens that allowed us to think more about sort of the life cycle of the building and what this would cost to own and operate 10, 20, 30 years into the future.
And what would you say that is the innovation that this project is bringing to the real estate market?
So, I mean, we've been in the business for a long time, but we've actually never built a building. And that might sound sort of like a disadvantage, but in some sense it gave us the capacity to look at this with fresh eyes. And so we didn't have any bad habits from building in the traditional way, which allowed us to evaluate a lot of these different opportunities almost from first principles to see whether these things make sense or not. And so with this project, we collaborated with Partisans Architects and Cree Buildings, and it was really sort of a marriage of ideas to create something that was highly sustainable. So in terms of the specific innovation, there's sort of a few things. There's the structure, which is very novel for Canada. So we've got this exterior single-loaded corridor system that surrounds a central courtyard, which is fairly common in Europe, but quite different in Canada. So one of the questions always we get asked is, how do you have exterior hallways when it snows and when it's windy outside? And so this is something very, very new. But the advantages of this is it allows the hallways to participate in the building actively. So they provide a substrate for socialization, where people can talk with their neighbors while their kids are playing down below in the courtyard. And it also gives you the opportunity to create really interesting unit layouts, because you have sunlight now on both sides and you can cross-ventilate. And so this structure actually it was a very performative function that contributed to the overall sustainability. This is also the first project in Canada, I believe, that is fully both heated and cooled via a radiant slab in the ceiling. So we have a concrete slab panel in the ceiling, and we have water running through it, and in the winter the water's warm, and in the summer the water's cold. And because Toronto's fairly humid, this was actually quite a difficult problem to solve. So the physical building is quite innovative. And all of this this structure was accomplished through with the Cree building system, one of our partners. And so there's sort of that aspect of it, the innovation of the structure itself. The other innovation is the process, and this is something that we're really, really interested in with Partisans and Sorotny Group and Cree Buildings, where we want to focus on this system of building, not the individual projects. Because what happens in the building industry when you focus on individual projects, there's no feedback loop, every project is a one-off, and there's no scale, both in learning but also in sort of reducing those costs over time. So if we compare that to the manufacturing sector, especially technology, you have these like massive improvements. So power windows on cars, for example, used to be super expensive when they first came out. Now you can't find a car without power windows. But you don't have this same degree of innovation in building where the quality goes up and the price goes down, and this is something that we're super interested in. And so by focusing at the level of a system intervention, it gives us the capacity to modify this model and to repeat it over time with different sorts of topologies, but focusing on this sort of long-term rental model.
How does this project contribute to the surrounding environment as well as the community?
So one of the things in Toronto is we're desperately in need of purpose-built rental. So every single purpose-built rental project, for the most part, was built in the 1950s and 60s in Toronto. So a lot of immigrants came in, there was a lot of building happening. Our grandfather immigrated here and started building these buildings. Certain policy changes, particularly rent control, just crushed supply. And so there was no more buildings built. And it was sort of a huge issue. And this is sort of when the condo boom took off. And so because we're in the apartment business, we wanted to focus on this asset class. And so in terms of this specific area, as I mentioned, this site wasn't sort of sought out, but it was pre-existing. We've owned it since 1960. And so what you're presented with is whatever the market is at that particular area. And so we don't have the luxury of choosing where to build. And so what this means is that whereas in the climate that we have in Toronto selects for apartment buildings that have small units and high rent, which means you only get them built in specific areas. That is, if you can make it work at all. We're sort of doing the opposite. So we're trying to find it. We have this mid-market location. It's not super high rent, it's not super low rent. It's kind of, call it the average. And so if you can produce this building that also has larger units and it works economically for a mid-market location, you're giving those units to the community that desperately needs this type of product, rental that is.
So sustainability should also consider affordability.
So yeah, so sustainability, again, it's one of these buzzwords where I think you really have to define what it is, right? It's green, it's sustainable, it's this, it's that. I mean, what are we talking about here? So, you know, the way that we think of sustainability is how do you build effectively better, faster, cheaper in an economically viable way, because if a project doesn't work economically, they're not going to get built, right? So you can have the greatest prototype in the world, but if it can't stand on its own 2 feet, you're out of luck. And so so the economics become a huge input. It's a huge sort of constraint on the design solution. Okay, so this is what we mean by sustainability. So right away we wanted to sort of disprove this notion that sustainability is expensive and fancy. And so what we want to do is build sort of as basic as possible. The energy bills are incredibly low. Maybe I didn't mention before, but it's an all-electric building. So that's heated, cooled, and everything else is powered electrically. And so the heating and cooling bills, the utility costs are quite low for our tenants. Same with the water bills, they're estimated to be quite low because it's such an efficient building. And there's a huge sort of alignment of just drawing more power from the grid and cost. You know, if you could reduce that overall, it's better for people's pockets, and it's better for the environment in general.
Thank you.